To talk about. Let's get to our panel right now. Joining us from Providence, Rhode Island, is Brown University professor Vladimir Golstein. With us here in the Washington studio is political journalist and commentator Steve Chaggaris. Frank Bowman is a law professor at the University of Missouri and the author of High Crimes and Misdemeanors, A History of Impeachment for the Age of Trump. He joins us via Skype. And with us from New York is political columnist and commentator Amy Holmes. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let us start in New York with Amy Holmes. Amy, the report is out, all 448 pages of it, and the big headline, of course, is no collusion. That gets President Trump off the hook on that charge. Is this a big victory for President Trump? Is this vindication?
Well, it is a huge victory for President Trump. He is now out of legal jeopardy. This two-year investigation, as you mentioned, with 19 lawyers, 40 investigators, 2,800 subpoenas, 500 witnesses, it's now behind him as a legal matter. As a political matter, as your correspondent in Washington noted, boy, you know, we have Game of Thrones ahead of us. Cutthroat politics will be the show every day, with Jerry Nadler running that to get those administration officials in front of him. But what I would note is this sort of smearing of the Attorney General, William Barr, trying to tarnish his reputation and his intent. We know that Robert Mueller, the special prosecutor, worked with the Attorney General for those redactions and in putting out this report. And in today's press conference, you saw the Deputy Attorney General, Mr. Rosenstein, standing behind him. This is the same man who we learned was willing to wear a wire to go into the Oval Office to possibly trap the president in a 25th Amendment sort of situation to take him out of office. So you can't say that Mr. Rosenstein was a fan of the president, but he was standing behind Attorney General William Barr.
Okay, Steve, the report's out, as I said. We knew about 3 weeks ago, I guess, when we had that summary, which was put out by William Barr, in which he told us that there was no collusion, there was no evidence that would justify any kind of obstruction charge against the president. So what did we learn today?
Well, we learned a lot of the details about why Mueller did not charge him with obstruction. And some of those details are very interesting, and I think it's going to provide a path for House Democrats, especially the House Judiciary Committee, to look a little bit deeper as to what these obstruction accusations are. Yes, the criminal part of this is now behind the president, but it is now in the court of public opinion. That includes what Congress is going to do looking into this. Bob Mueller was very clear, saying, look, I couldn't come to a conclusion on obstruction, but Congress, it's your turn to take a look at this, and if you want to go forth with impeachment, here's a laundry list of things that we saw, even though we couldn't charge him with any of this, or we didn't really feel like we could charge him with this. You take it and you see what you want to do. Now the question is, how much of a stomach does the American public have for this? You're hearing House Democratic leaders saying, ho, slow down on the impeachment thing. They're looking at polling that shows that Americans aren't necessarily supportive of impeachment. In fact, that number is actually going down in the last couple of months. So we'll see where this goes over the next few months as Nadler and other House Democrats look into this.
All right, Steve, just to be clear on something, as Amy Holmes told us a moment ago, the president is now out of any kind of legal jeopardy. So is this now, the process that we're going to see now, is that political?
Oh, it's absolutely political. And then you're seeing, I mean, one of the reasons why Democrats are going so hard against the Attorney General is because they need somebody to just sort of rail against on this. They know that they lost the argument on collusion. That the president has been exonerated on. He's right about that. When the president says obstruction, there needs to be a giant asterisk next to that, and that opens up, again, this big line of investigation from House Democrats. But I say House Democrats because Senate Republicans, House Republicans, they're saying this is all done. We're all done with this. Impeachment is going to go nowhere, even if the House Democrats want to do it in the House. Senate Republicans would never kick the president out of office.
Okay. Frank Bowman, let's listen to some of what the Attorney General had to say today. Let's watch this.
The report details efforts by the Internet Research Agency, a Russian company with close ties to the Russian government, to sow social discord among American voters through disinformation and social media operations. The special counsel found no collusion by any Americans in IRA's illegal activities.
So, Frank, what do you make of what we've seen and heard today, and is this investigation now over?
Well, I think the Mueller investigation is certainly over. But I think the notion that that the Mr. Trump has been exonerated on the question of obstruction of justice is certainly not the case. I mean, not only does the Mueller report not arrive at that conclusion, but in fact, if you read it carefully, I think it's almost impossible to avoid the conclusion that the Mueller team concluded a couple of important things. First of all, they rejected quite emphatically the idea that a president cannot be charged with obstruction of justice, or that a president cannot commit the crime of obstruction of justice. The end of the report is a long, elegant, and very persuasive rebuttal to the notion essentially advanced by Bill Barr and others that a president can't commit obstruction of justice by limiting or shutting down a criminal investigation. That plainly is not Mueller's view. Moreover, I think it's absolutely fascinating that they chose to include that in the report, because the only reason to include it in the report is if they also believed that the facts might well support the conclusion that Mr. Trump obstructed justice. Moreover, if you go through the very lengthy second half of this report, volume 2, I think it's impossible to conclude anything other than that. Members of the Mueller team, in fact, believe that Mr. Trump did commit obstruction of justice, or at a very minimum, that reasonable people could conclude precisely that. Now, there's never been any chance at all that Mueller was going to seek an indictment of this president, because the prevailing rule, the policy of the Justice Department, embodied by two memos from the Office of Legal Counsel, is that DOJ can't indict a president. Regardless of what Bob Mueller thinks about that legal position personally, he was never going to go against that policy. So the question has never been whether Trump was going to be indicted while he was in office by Mueller's people. The question has always been, what was Mueller going to discover about Mr. Trump's activities that might therefore form the basis of the conclusion that he's unfit for office. And that question remains very much open. And I think a careful reading of the Mueller report strongly suggests that there are plenty of grounds for concluding that.
So, Frank, if the president, a sitting president in this case, can't be indicted, why is so much being made of the fact that he may have obstructed justice?
Well, because obstruction in its various forms has been a common ground for impeaching presidents. Obstruction formed one of the bases for the impeachment efforts against both President Nixon and President Clinton. And what's more, when we're talking about obstruction of justice, we're talking about the notion that a president has failed in one of his most basic constitutional obligations, which is to see that the laws of the United States will be faithfully executed. And it's quite clear that Mueller understood, and writes into this report that at many points, the President of the United States sought to prevent the laws of the United States from being faithfully executed. Now, what Congress will make of that, what the public will make of that in the end, remains to be seen. But the facts contained in this report are absolutely devastating to anyone who maintains any notion that the President of the United States is supposed to behave in an honorable, law-abiding fashion.
All right, let me bring in Vladimir Golstein. Vladimir Golstein, Russia has been at the center of this investigation right from the time it started a little over 2 years ago. A couple of weeks ago, Russian journalist Alexei Kovalev wrote a piece in the New York Times in which he said that Russians were not waiting for Robert Mueller's report with quite the same excitement as Americans. The idea of Russia electing and controlling an American president has always been deemed absurd in Russia. If we look at the main charge of collusion being dismissed here, in a sense, has Russia been I guess, vindicated from the main charge of conspiracy?
Well, it's a paradoxical situation as a result of which we can say that President Trump is a winner, but I suspect Russia is not a winner, because criminal charges, legal charges cannot be now cannot be addressed to the president, but the usual campaign of demonizing Russia will continue, because this report leaves all these loopholes for this demonizing. The people will continue to mention this person, this group, or that group, and it will go on unabating, and it serves its purposes, and that's what should be stressed. The Democrats will continue to drive this campaign by trying to tar it, to sort of, to connect it in one way or another, Trump. They also would continue to sort of drive this campaign, blaming Russia for this or for that, to distract attention from their spectacular loss. What we have to remember that the whole Russia gate started after Hillary Clinton lost. And as a way to explain it, she brought Russia, and that's Russia hacked her DNC, computers, which is again, it remained to be sort of proven. There was, but in any case, so Democrats, to distract attention from their failures, to distract attention from the lack of their sort of concrete candidates, they will just prefer to blame Russia for everything and to try to connect any potential rival of theirs, be it Trump or anyone else, for being soft on Russia. And we've seen it before. This is, the same Cold War rhetoric, which sort of been played before, utilized before, served a number of politicians before. And I suspect the Democrats, for some reason, cannot get off of this. It's like a drug. So I think it will continue. That's my expectation. So maybe not concrete claims for impeaching President Trump, but blaming Russia, demonizing Russia will continue. And I think it's like,
right.
It's like if you have a, yeah.
But I'm wondering, Vladimir.
If I could jump in, I agree with Vladimir that the Russian collusion, confusion was concocted by the Hillary campaign to explain her defeat to President Trump in 2016. But I think Russia actually turns out to be the big winner in all of this. Let's remember that the Russian individuals who've been indicted, they're in Russia. They're never going to see an American courtroom. Meanwhile, sowing all of this confusion has tied up the American political system, Washington, D.C., undercut the President of the United States for 2 years. I think Russia has been very successful in interfering and affecting American politics.
One of the points that this report did make, Vladimir, is that there may have been no collusion, but Robert Mueller did come to the conclusion that Russia did interfere with the election.
Well, I think if you want to establish, there's something very serious on behalf of Russia, we should compare it with what sort of, say, other countries are doing. Is it beyond the ordinary? You know that the United States is the most important country in the world, and a lot of countries depend and worry about who's going to be elected. It can be Great Britain worried, Israel worried, Saudi Arabia worried. One of the very important players of the whole thing is Ukraine. They were very much concerned. And we know that, Manafort, which was always presented as some kind of a bridge between, Trump and Russia, turned out Manafort was working for Ukraine. Recently, an advisor of President Obama, Greg Crane, was indicted by Mueller Committee for working for Ukraine. So what should be established, if indeed it's a serious investigation, there should be a bunch of different committees who would assess the impact of Saudis, of Ukraine, and then shown that Russia actually went beyond the ordinary, because every country has their interests. The United States interferes in the elections all over the world. Is Russia doing something extraordinary? If they do, then something should be talked about. But if they do is on the same level as other countries, then it's just basically red herring. Red herring created by Democrats to achieve their particular goals, which self-defeating. American public are actually, I'm sure, that tired of it. They want to see fresh face of Democrats who will come up with a good program for the country, not blaming Russians, demonizing some kind of a minority. We've been there before, and this is just, it doesn't look very good.
Steve, to Amy's point about, the fact that this investigation and what we're hearing about the Mueller report is really sucking all the oxygen out of the air politically here in Washington, in the country. And if this moves towards impeachment, if the Democrats in Congress say, well, look, we're going to move in that direction, is this going to be the issue we're going to be talking about for the next 2 years?
Yeah, but that's a big if. I mean, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, has said that unless there's compelling evidence that comes to light, she doesn't think that they should go toward impeachment. Now, keep in mind, one of the other guests referenced Bill Clinton and Richard Nixon. There were other charges there. Bill Clinton, there was a perjury charge, a couple of perjury charges actually, which made that a little bit easier to bring up, but even then they weren't able to kick him out of office. And so Democrats are going to be calculating this and saying, is this enough to start talking about impeachment. We're almost 18 months away from the presidential election. Steny Hoyer, the House Majority Leader, said, look, the real thing here is the election. If we want to get rid of Donald Trump, let's focus on November of 2020 and not focus on impeachment. So,
and if I could add to that,
yeah.
Congresswoman Debbie Dingell from Michigan today, she's been tasked with giving the Democratic response to the Mueller report over the weekend. Today I saw her on television saying, you know, when I was home this week with my constituents, what were they telling me about? They were telling me about healthcare. They were telling me about inhaler prices going up to $700. That is what voters at home want to hear about. I'll also call your attention to a poll that was conducted exactly a month ago before the Barr, his mini report, and then of course today's Mueller's report. A month ago, USA Today conducted a poll and found that 50% of Americans believed that Trump was a victim of a witch hunt. This is not something that's going to go over with voters if Democrats go down this rabbit hole for the next 18 months.
Yeah, Amy makes a very good point about what people outside of Washington are talking about, and it's not Russia. And you hear these anecdotal stories of these presidential candidates who are out in Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina and Nevada getting ready for next year. They're not asked about Russia. They're asked about issues. And so Democrats are hearing that, I think, Democrats in Washington are hearing that, and they're coming to the conclusion that, yes, the impeachment story and the Russia story is not going away. There's a lot of other stuff involving the president, involving the president's finances. There are a lot of other shoes to drop on this stuff, and that's not going away. But for that to be the thrust of their argument for the next 18 months, they don't see that as a winning situation. They want to focus on the issues, and I think you're hearing that from voters outside of Washington.
What are your thoughts on that, Frank? Because as you pointed out, there's a lot of material in this report that some see as some kind of a roadmap for Democrats to ultimately, I guess, go to impeachment, but there are a lot of risks in that for the Democrats as well, aren't there?
Well, a couple of points. I want to step back and address a couple of things said by the other guests. I mean, the notion that this is some kind of witch hunt, that this is some kind of conspiracy against Russia brought by crazy Democrats is really fairly comical. This is an investigation that was conducted very carefully by Bob Mueller, who is a lifelong Republican, in a Justice Department run by Republicans. Rod Rosenstein's a Republican. Jeff Sessions is a Republican. All these people who are running this investigation are Republicans. And even Bill Barr, in the course of exonerating the president quite gleefully from any notion of active cooperation with the Russians, is quite careful to point out that the Russians indeed did interfere in the 2016 election. Now, the question of whether or not their interference actually had any effect on the result, that's a fair question. And I think one could debate that and could be debating it endlessly. But the notion that this is some kind of a witch hunt is simply absurd. And that it's a partisan witch hunt is simply one of the Trump talking points. Now, beyond that, it's certainly also fair to say that impeachment is a designedly political process. And there are going to be serious questions about whether or not Democrats feel that it is in their advantage to proceed actively down that road. I think they may well decide that's not the case, and that the proper way to address these problems is to consider other issues. But if they do, and this is the final point I'd make, there are lots of other things to consider other than this report. As I've written previously in other venues, it's always been a mistake to focus on the Mueller investigation when considering the broader question of whether or not Mr. Trump is fit for office.
Vladimir Golstein, do you think this was not a witch hunt, that this was actually something that was motivated by Russian behavior, which had to be legally investigated, that led to the appointment of a special counsel?
Well, I think, if you consider, for example, let's move to Salem, Massachusetts, 300 years ago when they had actual witch hunts. There will be, for example, a bad weather, a storm. And I can easily imagine that one of the women who lived there wanted the storm. But to blame this woman for the storm which happened is ridiculous. And, so that's exactly what's happened. The storm was there. Hillary Clinton lost the trust of American people and was not elected. That's all. Whatever Russians do, even your guests recognize it. That, whatever they try to do, they will attempt to put some ad or something. It amounts to nothing. Just to start blaming the messenger for the storm, it's not quite credible. Furthermore, one of the charges against the Russians, which Mueller Commission accepted, was the charge by some kind of company called CrowdStrike, hired by a Democratic National Committee when they claimed that their computers were hacked. Since then, a lot of very serious, reputable forensic specialists, including former technical directors of National Security Agency, said it's not convincing. It's not convincing, the Russian hack. So I think basically a lot of people recognize that this Russia Gate is more or less weapons of mass destruction of this generation. So of course we remember reputable people, you know, like Colin Powell and all this, you know, showing some phony proofs, but you know they proved in the long run they proved phony, and the same thing is here. So why distract attention? It's not quite clear to me.
All right, Steve, you know, in today's news conference before the report was released, William Barr did try to give us some kind of insight into what the president was thinking, what his thoughts were at the time when this investigation was announced. Let's watch that part of it.
As the special counsel's report acknowledges, there is substantial evidence to show that the president was frustrated and angered by his sincere belief that the investigation was undermining his presidency, propelled by his political opponents, and fueled by illegal leaks. Nonetheless, the White House fully cooperated with the special counsel's investigation.
So right from the beginning, it seems the president believed that this was politically motivated, that this was an attempt to unseat him. This was something masquerading as a legal issue.
Well, we shouldn't forget that after the president won the election and won the Electoral College, but not the popular vote, there was just a lot of discussion about whether this was a legitimate election, and Russia was thrown out there. And so there was almost this obsession by the president at every turn to say, I won the election legitimately, and it was clearly part of his thinking when a lot of this stuff cropped up. And so, you know, it's not a surprise to hear that this was such on the mind of the president so deeply. What was a little strange there was William Barr suggesting what the president's state of mind was, and Democrats are criticizing him for basically going out there and saying, you know, playing this up as the president's a victim.
Amy, very quickly, Democrats in Congress, they're not satisfied with this. We already heard today they are not happy with the redacted Mueller report. They want to see the whole thing, including testimony that's protected by law, grand jury testimony. Are there still big political and legal issues for the president ahead?
Well, Democrats know that they cannot get that grand jury testimony, and that a judge, there was just, you know, recently a decision about this, that that a judge would not allow them to see that. William Barr, he laid out 4 categories of redaction. One was grand jury, one was national security sources and methods. The third was privacy concerns for third parties. So looking at this, our Democrats, I think they're making a lot of noise, and then in order to set up the Attorney General for somehow not being fully transparent when they know fully well that they can't get that grand jury material.
Okay, and we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.